I need to start by telling you about the alarm. Every Monday morning at 11:30 in my hometown of Plymouth, a siren rings out from the Devonport Royal Dockyard. It's a proper classic warning siren, and it is loud. It echoes around the city. Throughout the course of my life, it's punctuated maths lessons, work meetings, family occasions, walks in the park. For everyone who lives here, it's a weirdly normal part of weekly life.
People living here close to Devonport Dockyard have grown used to this sound, but they hope this is the only time they'll ever get to hear it.
I say weird because the weekly sounding of that alarm is a test to prepare for nuclear emergency. See, one of the Devonport Royal Dockyard's roles is as a repair and refitting base for the UK's 4 Vanguard-class submarines, which, when not in Plymouth or in their full-time home in Scotland, patrol the ocean as the UK's continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. Each submarine can be armed with up to 16 Trident II D5 ballistic missiles, each with a range of up to 7,500 miles, and armed with a payload up to 6 times as powerful as that which was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Yet, it's not in anticipation of nuclear strike that the siren exists. The real fear is of a radiation leak from one of the nuclear reactors from which the submarines draw their power during their long, lonely missions. This risk is increased by the presence of a so-called nuclear graveyard, in which 13 unused submarines, some of which have been out of action for more than 30 years, sit with their reactors still intact, waiting for the government to cough up the cash to decommission them. Growing up, all of this felt quite quaint, a little bit kitsch maybe. The Cold War was long since over, and nuclear submarines felt as much an anachronism as Blitz tea parties or Civil War battle reenactments. But last year, Russian propagandist and broadcaster Evgeny Popov took to the airwaves of the state-run Rossiya 1 channel and listed off what Vladimir Putin's targets might be in the event of a nuclear exchange.
Вашингтон ставит не только Лондон, но и Манчестер, Бирмингем, крупнейшую военно-морскую базу Devonport.
And look, I always appreciate seeing my hometown on TV, even if it is as part of an apocalyptic prediction. But recently, the chances of that prediction coming true haven't seemed as remote as they once did. This is the New START Treaty, or to give it its official title, the Treaty between the United States of America and the Russian Federation on measures for the further reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms. At time of recording, it is the last remaining treaty limiting the number of nuclear weapons in the world. Signed in April 2010 by Barack Obama and then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, it places a hard cap on the number of nukes that both Russia and America can have deployed at any one time. The cap of 1,550 nuclear warheads might sound like quite a lot, but it represented the fewest nuclear weapons those countries had ever had ready to fire at one another at any one time. In February 2026, which by the time you're watching this might be now, that changes. Because on the 4th of that month, this treaty runs out.
We're about to live in a world where strategic nuclear weapons of the 2 greatest nuclear powers are uncapped.
This is Eliana Johns. Eliana is a senior research associate for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists.
The history of our organization is actually pretty interesting. So we were founded in 1945 by some of the scientists who participated in the Manhattan Project. So from that legacy, my team works on kind of, the way we like to frame it is we're trying to pull back the curtain on nuclear secrecy, because nuclear weapons really are able to thrive in secrecy when they're not talked about, when they're hidden from the public view, from public scrutiny.
Eliana has written extensively on the past, present, and future of nuclear weapons, and so she seemed like the perfect person to fill me in on what the ending of this crucial treaty actually means.
It will be the first time in more than 50 years that the United States and Russia, or I guess the former Soviet Union, are not bound by some form of strategic arms control arrangement or engaged in dialogue about their nuclear weapons. What that means is after the treaty expires, the US and Russia won't be bound or obligated by any agreement, so they'll have the capacity to upload hundreds and hundreds of nuclear warheads if they don't decide to continue abiding by these treaty limits, or if they don't reach some other form of agreement.
There couldn't be a worse time for this to be happening. One of the reasons that this treaty is expiring in the first place is that geopolitical tensions are currently desperately high. And I wrote that line before the US kidnaps Maduro and whatever the other major military world event is which happens between us filming this, editing it, and getting it out. On top of all of that other stuff, countries are increasingly turning to nuclear weapons to show their might.
I think you probably hear people talking about this new nuclear age that we're in. We're in a new environment that we haven't really experienced before. Nuclear weapons are kind of coming to the forefront of media, of policy conversations once again.
Evgeny Popov's veiled threat to bomb my house followed a stream of saber-rattling from Putin himself. Ever since he launched his invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Russian president has barely shut up about his nuclear weapons. He's both lowered the threshold at which Russia says it will use its nukes and gifted a number of tactical nuclear weapons to its ally Belarus. As recently as October, he announced a new underwater nuclear drone called Poseidon, which he claimed could put entire states out of operation.
Ради чего вы это делаете? Насколько страна готова будет подхватить то, что сделаете вы?
Never one to be outblustered, Donald Trump soon took to Truth Social to announce that the US would be resuming nuclear testing.
Other countries are testing. We're the only country that doesn't test, and I don't want to be the only country that doesn't test.
Although Energy Secretary Chris Wright soon caveated that this wouldn't involve actual nuclear detonations. China, meanwhile, has doubled the size of its nuclear arsenal since 2020, and even the UK has been upping its game, recently announcing that it would be buying 12 F-35A planes capable of carrying American nuclear gravity bombs.
It marks the return of the RAF to nuclear deterrence for the first time in 3 decades, representing the biggest strengthening of our deterrence posture in a generation.
There are proliferation concerns in several countries that are quite serious, and there are threats and potential preparations for returning to nuclear testing. All of these are factors that characterize this new nuclear age that we're in, and really heighten the risks of nuclear use in a way that we haven't seen in the past few decades.
All of this has been accompanied by a glut of nuclear storytelling in books, on TV, and at the cinema. These narratives, however, sometimes imply that our current nuclear situation in the real world is a simple return to the state of play as it existed at the height of the Cold War. In today's video, I want to explore the various ways in which our current teeter on the edge of the nuclear precipice both is and isn't different to before, and the 3 things which put us at most risk of tipping over the edge. The great irony of the position we're currently in is that when it comes to trying to rid the world of nuclear weapons, we were doing so well.
I mean, the gains were first made in the sort of the 50s and 60s with the huge level of opposition to nuclear testing.
This is Sophie Bolt, General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
We're a very long-standing peace organisation that people might know from the sort of the peace symbol, this very iconic peace symbol, which is semaphore for CND, for Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
The CND was founded in 1958 after the UK tested its first successful hydrogen bomb on Christmas Island.
People were terrified that they were going to be absorbing, all this sort of radiation, and they were going to be, passing on to their children and what have you. So, there was a huge, massive mobilisation. In fact, that's partly how CND came into existence.
As Sophie explained, the path to this treaty was forged way back in 1963, with the signing of this treaty, the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Let me show you something. In the 18 years since the testing of the first nuclear device, the world's total nuclear stockpiles had risen from the initial 3 developed by the Manhattan Project to a whopping 32,648. Developing these weapons had involved hundreds of tests, each with devastating effects on the environment. They were also unpredictable. The 1954 Castle Bravo test, the largest ever undertaken by the US military, had turned out to be twice as powerful as researchers had thought, and ended up killing a Japanese fisherman. There were also horrific consequences for the military personnel involved in carrying out these tests.
What a lot of people might have heard about is the nuclear test veterans. These were kind of British troops who were treated like, guinea pigs and made to sit and so physically experience nuclear explosions, and of course suffered, horrific, consequences.
In response to campaigns and marches like those organised by the CND then, the Soviet Union, the United States and the United Kingdom agreed to ban all future overground testing of nuclear devices.
So that was like saying, we will not allow any explosions.
The results were pretty immediate. Over the next 5 years, the rate at which nuclear warheads were being developed slowed significantly. In 1968 actually saw a slight decrease, from just over 40,000 nuclear warheads being available to use in the world to 39,500. This was just in time for the signing of this treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, at least in theory, bans non-nuclear countries from becoming so.
It's a deal, in a way, between the nuclear states and the non-nuclear states, because the deal is that the nuclear weapon states will get rid of their nuclear weapons, and the non-nuclear states will not get any nuclear weapons.
The actual disarmament part of the treaty was more of an ambition than a commitment. More concrete was the manner in which the Non-Proliferation Treaty worked to avoid an arms race in terms of the number of countries which had nuclear weapons, through freezing it at the 5 nations which had already built and tested a bomb at this point. These were the United States, the Soviet Union, the UK, France and China. The treaty hasn't been entirely successful in this. India, Israel and Pakistan never signed and have since developed nuclear weapons, while North Korea pulled out in 2003. Whatever its limitations, however, the fact that there are still only 9 countries in the world with nuclear weapons, we don't find ourselves in a situation where every country has a bunch of nukes pointed at every other, is largely attributable to this document. The fact it was signed way back in 1970 also goes to show how quickly nuclear weapons came to be seen as a particular type of weapon, different to any other.
And these weapons are so horrific when you look at the destructive power, but also what they do to human beings. They are so destructive. The way in which they kind of kill people is so horrific that they have no place in a civilized society.
By the early 1970s, the 2 main nuclear powers, the US and the Soviet Union, were already looking at how to place hard caps on the number of nuclear weapons that each had pointed at the other. Soviet warhead production was really getting into full swing at this point, and in fact the total number of warheads had gone up once again to just under 42,000. And it's against this backdrop that this treaty was signed, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Rather than limiting the number of nuclear weapons that each country could have pointed at the other, Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev agreed to reduce the level of defense that each of their countries had against potential nuclear attack by the other. At the time, the US and the USSR had been building complexes of interceptor systems designed to destroy incoming nuclear missiles before they could reach their target. This had a significant downside, however, in that it risked accelerating the nuclear arms race even further. See, the easiest way to overcome these interceptor systems is simply to chuck more nuclear weapons at them than they can stop. The concern then was that, as each nuclear superpower's defences got better, the other would build more nukes in an unstoppable escalation. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty thus saw the US and the Soviet Union make the genuinely brave decision to limit themselves to just 2 interceptor complexes, with just 100 anti-ballistic missiles in each. More than just the specific defences that this treaty placed on each country's nuclear defences, however, Nixon's trip to Moscow also proved that an ever-escalating nuclear arms race wasn't inevitable. In fact, the same series of talks led to the signing of this treaty, which is perhaps the closest to genuine nuclear disarmament we ever got. The Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty, or SALT II to its friends, was signed in Vienna in 1979, this time by Brezhnev and Jimmy Carter. Reducing both countries' stockpiles would have seen the total number of warheads in the world go from more than 53,000 to around about 5. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. The dream of SALT II quickly turned into a nightmare when the USSR invaded Afghanistan. Any sense that the Cold War could soon be over evaporated, and rather than the number of nuclear weapons falling, they continued to climb. That is until 1987. Because that December, something incredible happened. The first was the signing of this treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. This saw the US and USSR agree to actively destroy all of their ground-launched ballistic missiles with ranges between 1,000 and 5,000 kilometers, regardless of whether they were nuclear or conventionally armed.
So there was obviously a huge amount of international pressure to make, Russia and the US get rid of these sort of nuclear weapons, but it was the huge protests in Britain and across Europe specifically against these missiles, like these cruise missiles, these long-range missiles that were so dangerous, that forced, for instance, Reagan to sign up to that treaty and to literally destroy, thousands of these long-range missiles. So, and that was because of, again, literally people, signing the petitions, going on the demos and speaking out.
Both countries retained their largest so-called strategic missiles capable of travelling halfway around the globe, but the scrapping of these shorter-range missiles meant a significant reduction in the number of Soviet and American missiles being placed in Europe, drastically cooling tensions. The biggest turnaround, however, came in overall stocks. The year 1987 marks the first year in nearly 2 decades that the number of nuclear weapons in the world at that December was lower than it had been the previous January. The nuclear arms race was effectively over, and the number of warheads in the world was about to spiral downwards and downwards. Between just 1986 and 1991, the world would shed 15,000 warheads, an unthinkable decline which would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The real stake in the heart of what's sometimes called the First Nuclear Age, however, came in 1991, with the signing of this bad boy, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START.
That again is a bilateral treaty between the two, massive, nuclear powers.
START didn't go quite as far as SALT II would have in its limits on nuclear warheads, but it did commit both the US and what was about to become the Russian Federation to having no more than 1,600 nuclear-armed bombs or missiles deployed at any one time. It's hard to get across just how much of a massive victory all of this is for international diplomacy. The START Treaty sent the world's stocks of nuclear warheads into nearly terminal decline. By 2009, there had been an 82% reduction in the number of nuclear warheads hanging about in the world, making the chances of mutually assured destruction lower than ever. It just goes to show that in the right time and with the right context, diplomacy works. Unfortunately, it wasn't to last. My heart. Here we go. Okay, so earlier on I promised to tell you some of the key things which have changed since the height of the Cold War and today. The first is that the scariest bombs today often aren't the biggest. It's quite popular in news reports and online videos about nuclear weapons to hyperfixate on how much larger the explosive power of the nuclear missiles we have today is compared to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And we could do that. We could talk more about the Castle Bravo and Tsar Bomba tests. We could pull up Alex Wallerstein's excellent nuke map and see what the damage would be if a Russian RS-24 landed on Devonport Dockyard. Oh, I am so dead. But we really need to talk about small nukes.
Low-yield nuclear weapons are not a new issue. They've been around since the very beginning, and the thought of using low-yield nuclear weapons on the battlefield or for military purposes really came about early on after the first nuclear weapons were used.
See, while a perception of nuclear weapons as an entirely different category of weapon to a handgun, artillery piece, or conventional torpedo did emerge reasonably quickly, there remained some military leaders who continued to see nukes as, in many ways, just a big bomb. And big bombs could be useful. In 1953, the US Army started rolling out its MGR-1 Honest John rockets, which were effectively just an artillery unit. You point it in the direction of the enemy, press fire, and a launcher just throws it at them. The only difference is that, instead of a conventional shell, what lands is a nuclear warhead with a yield somewhere between 2 and 30 kilotons. The US, UK, and Soviet Union all also developed nuclear depth charges designed to be dropped from ships in order to destroy submarines. Guided torpedoes weren't particularly sophisticated at this point, and so the thought was that you could considerably increase the chances of destroying a submarine if you just set off a 32 kiloton nuke in the general vicinity.
All of this obviously sounds incredibly slapstick. In fact, both of the video games I can think of which involve tactical nukes do so as a kind of joke. So obviously the original version of this was going to be that I was going to be playing Modern Warfare 2 and then I was going to get all the kill streaks and then I was going to drop the tactical nuke. However, couldn't get Modern Warfare 2 to work on any of the computers that we have. So we've gone for Nuketown as the kind of backup option. But all of these plans to use nuclear weapons as just large bombs were very much real.
During the Cold War, there were numerous kinds of nuclear weapons and tens of thousands of nuclear weapons across the world that were deployed by Russia and the United States. And within that, you had varying levels.
The Falcon AIM-26A, for example, was a 1950s air-to-air missile which operated on a similar logic to nuclear depth charges. It didn't matter if the missile you were firing at an incoming Soviet bomber wasn't particularly accurate if it was fitted with a 1.5 kiloton nuclear warhead.
In Culver City, California, the Falcon, the U.S. Air Force's newest guided missile. An artist's conception shows how the electronic missile is launched and, with a brain of its own, hunts out and destroys enemy bombers.
The same W-54 warhead was also fitted onto America's infamous M28 and M29 Davy Crockett system, which allowed a team as small as 3 to fire a relatively tiny 10-ton nuke at the enemy.
At certain points, there were even ideas for backpacks that had nuclear weapons where a soldier would jump out of a plane to be able to place a backpack under a bridge, and that would be the tactical effect you're looking to achieve.
If the idea of using nuclear weapons just like any other kind of weapon sounds a little bit dicey, then politicians, military leaders, and others sometimes try and distinguish between what they call strategic nuclear weapons and so-called tactical nuclear weapons.
Strategic nukes are the massive, city-busting, intercontinental ballistic missiles we think of when we think of a nuclear exchange between superpowers. They're strategic because they're designed to be used as a means of strategic bombing, which is a bit of a euphemism. Strategic bombing almost always refers to the indiscriminate bombing of large cities in order to try and break citizens' morale. A strategic nuclear attack would mean the flattening of a major city in the vein of America's destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. A tactical nuke refers to the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield in order to achieve much more limited military objectives. An Honest John fired at an advancing division of tanks, or a Falcon AIM-26A fired from a fighter jet at a bomber. The very idea of a tactical nuke might sound farcical. But from the early 1960s through to the early 1990s, most of the nuclear weapons which were in service at any one time were tactical. The American truck-loaded Pershing ballistic missiles stationed in West Germany during the 1980s, for example, weren't designed to flatten Minsk, they were designed to take out Soviet command stations in the event of an invasion of Western Europe.
In reality, though, this entire distinction between strategic nuclear weapons and tactical ones is kind of nonsense.
I mean, I feel like this is a bit of a PR thing. Do you know what I mean? To say, oh, these little tactical nuclear weapons are not as dangerous as like the big strategic nuclear weapons, but in reality, they do the same thing.
I opened this section by suggesting that we were about to talk about small nukes, which in reality is a little bit of a lie. See, as I mentioned a moment ago, what really separates strategic nuclear weapons from tactical ones is not firepower, but use. Tactical nuclear weapons often can be smaller than strategic ones, but they very much don't have to be. The original Honest Johns, for example, were larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. whilst the Pershing 1s were at least 4 times as powerful, with the potential to be up to 26 times as powerful.
It will release radioactive fallout that will, drift for miles and miles and miles, and will, have huge impact on our ecosystems. So whether they are, called tactical or whether they're called strategic, they do the same thing.
Even the smallest tactical nuclear weapon ever built, the Davy Crockett, if used, would destroy a good chunk of the Vatican City and kill a few hundred people. This comes with the most obvious risk that, if you use it, you end up killing or injuring a bunch of your own troops alongside whatever enemy forces you are hoping to incapacitate. Even if you only take out the enemy, using tactical nuclear weapons in any kind of defensive capacity is likely to involve setting off a nuclear bomb in either your own country or that of an ally. A Falcon AIM-26A air-to-air missile might help to destroy a Soviet bomber headed for London, but you have just showered half of Margate in nuclear radiation. The very smallest nuclear weapons, relatively speaking, thus came to be retired as soon as missile and torpedo guidance technology made it possible to destroy enemy vehicles in more intelligent ways than just throwing nukes at them.
The Sparrow is a supersonic beam rider using a solid propellant.
These are not weapons that can be used in a kind of a tactical way, as they call it. They're not precise weapons, you know what I mean?
The biggest pitfall to tactical nuclear weapons, however, is outlined in this essay. Published by Nina Tannenwald in 1999, it outlines the idea of the nuclear taboo. Tannenwald suggests that at the same time as the Honest Johns and Davy Crockett's were being developed, so too was emerging this idea that nuclear weapons actually weren't like any other weapon. The size of their firepower and the unique side effect of radiation kind of set them apart as another thing entirely.
Using a nuclear weapon suddenly wasn't a good look. More than this, the same nuclear taboo which was deterring one side from using nuclear weapons was also giving the other pause for thought. The fear was that even just using a cheeky little 0.02 kiloton Davy Crockett in a localized battle might break that taboo and set off a tit-for-tat exchange of nuclear missiles, ending with total mutual destruction anyway.
The problem with this is that it actually lowers the threshold of nuclear use, where countries become more willing and they consider nuclear use more acceptable because it might theoretically cause less damage than maybe a multi-megaton warhead would. So it's a really dangerous idea to assume that a single warhead could be used without incredible consequences and ramifications, or that its use could be acceptable.
It's for a mixture of all of these reasons and more that ridding the world of tactical nuclear weapons was generally seen as a far greater priority during the Cold War than ridding the world of strategic ones. The vast bulk of weapons which were dismantled in the late 1980s and early 1990s were tactical. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, for instance, explicitly sought to tackle weapons such as the American Pershings and Soviet RSD-10s. Regardless of how powerful they were, and they were still plenty powerful, the fear was that tactical weapons were far more dangerous in their potential for being the spark which lit the fuse of nuclear war.
And that's part of what we're seeing, where norms are starting to erode across the board, with Russia threatening nuclear use in Ukraine, countries increasing their nuclear rhetoric in an attempt to signal. All of these things are contributing to this idea that nuclear use could be acceptable in low-yield circumstances.
One of the most terrifying aspects in current conversations surrounding nuclear weapons, then, is that this long-established notion that nuclear weapons need to be treated differently to other kinds of weapons is gradually being abandoned.
We're seeing a resurgence of conversations about low-yield nuclear weapons, where countries are seeking what they call flexible response options to achieve military or political objectives.
The F-35A fighter jets the UK is currently looking at buying are not only notable for being the first time in more than 2 decades that the British Armed Forces will have the capability to drop nuclear bombs rather than just its Trident submarine program, but also because where Trident is a strategic system, the F-35As would be for tactical use.
The question is whether the deployment of more low-yield weapons is likely to increase the chances of them actually being used, and subsequently whether the breaking of that nuclear taboo through the use of just a little nuke is likely to quickly lead to much bigger weapons being used too. The end of the age of nuclear treaties began with the death of this one, my beloved anti-ballistic missile treaty.
In 2002, the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which influenced Russia and China in developing and modernizing new nuclear systems like hypersonics in order to counter US missile defenses. So that kind of is where a lot of people say things really started kicking off.
George Bush Jr.'s rationale for pulling out of the treaty was that with the Cold War over, the main threat to peace and stability now came from terrorists and rogue states who would love to throw a missile at America. The ABM, he warned, was holding the US back from being able to defend itself against future such attacks.
No one was entirely flippant about the potential that the ripping up of the ABM might come with negative consequences. The US was fully expecting that in response to it pulling out of that treaty, Russia would choose to pull out of START 2, the follow-on treaty from START 1 which we mentioned earlier. And they do. The day after the ABM is dead, so too is START. The consolation is that George Bush Jr. and Vladimir Putin opted in preparation to sign this treaty, the Strategic Offensive Reductions Treaty, or SORT, which in truth is a bit of a sticking plaster. For clarity, most of these treaties which we have hanging up here, we chose to print off fewer pages than we maybe could have so that, the string would stay standing up. SORT is legitimately just over 2 pages.
It placed some limits on the number of warheads which each country could have deployed, but still allowed both signatories to keep as many additional warheads as they liked in storage. While there were still some warheads being dismantled due to old age then, the rate did begin to slow. Nevertheless, with the War on Terror having replaced the Cold War as the key narrative of global geopolitics, relations between the world's 2 foremost nuclear superpowers remained at least warm.
In fact, in April 2010, Barack Obama and Dmitry Medvedev signed this bad boy, the New START Treaty, the one that I mentioned right back at the beginning of this video.
The New START Treaty.
This placed the strictest limits yet on the number of nuclear weapons which each country could have deployed. It also allowed for continuous monitoring of the other country to make sure that both were playing ball.
And then you have New START, of course, which is it places limits on deployed US and Russian strategic launchers, and it's been one of many in a series of core strategic arms control arrangements.
There were a really good 3 years here. In February 2014, however, Russia decided to invade Ukraine, for the first time. Worse still, in late 2016, the Russian military announced that it was working on reviving its Iskander-M short-range ballistic missile program, marking a return of our good old friend, the tactical nuke. Then new President Donald Trump quickly declared that he felt this to be a violation of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty from back in 1987.
So Europe was already pretty shaken up at this point, and it proved to be a key factor in a lot of the changes that we're seeing today.
Very soon, the INF was all but dead, something which would be confirmed 6 years later through the medium of Twitter, of all things. There remained some hope that the US and Russia might be brought back to the table to discuss an extension of New START. There was just one problem. Donald Trump wanted to include China, and China didn't want to play ball. SORT, the sticking plaster treaty, that had expired a long time ago by this point, and to be honest, SORT 2 never came into force. That really should have just come down partway through the previous section with a bit of string. Sorry about that. There remain some nuclear treaties still in place, limits on testing and on countries which aren't already nuclear powers being able to become so. The strength of those really relies on the strength of international cooperation more broadly, which, as things stand, isn't looking super strong. What is clear is that the age of nuclear treaties which place hard caps on the number of nuclear weapons that different countries are allowed to have appears to be over. That was harder than I thought it was going to be. So, yeah. The second really big thing which has changed since the Cold War is China.
China first became a nuclear power in 1964, the 5th country to do so, and the last to be included as a recognised nuclear state in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. For a long time though, China's actual nuclear arsenal wasn't all that much to write home about. When Bush and Putin signed SALT back in 2002, China didn't even receive a mention at the press conference. As recently as 2012, China had just 240 nuclear warheads. That's fewer than the 300 held by France and a minuscule amount in comparison to the nearly 5,000 apiece stockpiled by the US and Russia. Moreover, that number had been pretty flat since the 1980s.
This was, at least in part, because of this statement. Immediately after testing their first atomic bomb in 1964, the Chinese government immediately issued this statement, committing themselves to a policy of no first use. They were effectively saying that while they did now have nuclear weapons, they would only ever consider using them in retaliation, never as an initial act of aggression.
In building their nuclear arsenal then, China's approach has largely been to maintain a nuclear capability which they describe as lean and effective, enough to deter anyone from launching a nuclear strike on them and no more. China has also repeatedly attempted to get other countries to adopt the same approach.
Back in 1994, China issued a draft treaty to the other 4 nuclear powers, which, if adopted, would have made no first use a mutual nuclear policy for everyone. In the years since, they have repeatedly tried to make that the case. And yet all of this at the same time as they've been massively expanding their nuclear arsenal.
We're seeing China in particular build up and expand its nuclear forces in a way that is unprecedented. And this is a cause for concern because we've primarily placed limits on strategic nuclear weapons through a bipolar world where it was 2 countries who were able to work towards communication, work towards, building trust and good faith measures, building predictability. For decades and decades, it was just those 2 countries trying to work together to understand each other and to agree to certain norms and limits. And when you add a 3rd country into that mix, it complicates things because each country believes it has to defend against now 2 other large arsenals.
Between 2020 and 2025, China's nuclear arsenal doubled from around 300 warheads to 600. The US and Russia still maintain the vast bulk of the world's warheads, but China's capability now far surpasses that of France, the UK, and every other state. Moreover, a far greater proportion of China's weapons are actually deployed, whereas the majority of America and Russia's remain in storage.
The addition of China to the equation isn't just a case of there being more nuclear weapons in the world than there might have been otherwise. It's also a case that having 3 nuclear superpowers just makes every aspect of all of this all the more volatile.
It makes agreeing treaties much harder, because now there are 3 participants in any negotiation rather than just 2. It also makes it much harder to avoid an arms race, as every time country A builds its nuclear capacity in response to country B, country C is likely to follow suit as well.
It complicates this idea of building trust and predictability when you have an entire other country that operates completely differently, has completely different history and systems and even priorities, right? Russia's goals and priorities are not the same as China's goals and priorities, are not the same as the US goals and priorities. So you're trying to balance all 3 of these. And I think when we look to a future in which we are in this multipolar situation, we see a lot of new technologies entering the scene, there could be opportunities for some kind of 3-way multipolar arms control arrangement between China, Russia, and the United States, but arms control might have to look differently than what we've seen it before.
Of course, all of this assumes that our leaders are trying to avoid a nuclear war. Most of us take it for granted that our presidents and prime ministers understand that winning a nuclear conflict is impossible. And yet, what if that core tenet of nuclear strategy is being forgotten? In the popular imagination, a nuclear exchange is just that. Country A fires all of their nuclear weapons at country B fires all of theirs back, maybe even country C gets involved. The winner is essentially whoever manages to fire more of their weapons first. But what if there was another way? Shit!
This is a video of Israel's Iron Dome air defense system. Iron Dome is one of 3 complementary systems designed to protect Israel's urban areas from rocket attack. Each system is able to intercept missiles of varying ranges before they land. The IDF claims that Iron Dome in particular has an accuracy rate of more than 90%, having intercepted thousands and thousands of rockets.
Perhaps inspired by these impressive statistics, Donald Trump recently announced that he would be building a similar system to protect the American homeland. He called it Golden Dome, because of course he did.
He says that Golden Dome will involve both physical interceptor devices and high-powered lasers, and some of it will be based in space. It will also involve artificial intelligence integration, because of course it will. Initial cost estimates suggest that the system is likely to cost up to $3.6 trillion. And while Trump says it will be finished by the end of this presidential term, other commentators are less sure it will ever exist at all. And that's because building this kind of interceptor system to combat nuclear attack is basically impossible.
When it comes to the issue of missile defense, for instance, when we test missile defenses and when we look at the effectiveness and accuracy, they don't actually work that well. So at least with the technology that we have and the cost that it takes to have effective missile defenses, you don't necessarily need the newest technology in order to evade them.
To anyone who was alive during the 1980s, the basic concept behind Golden Dome might not sound all that new. And that's because it's not. In 1984, Ronald Reagan launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, a very similar sounding plan to make nuclear weapons obsolete, with proposals including both physical interceptors and high-powered lasers, some of which would be based in space.
SDI wasn't, as Reagan might have hoped, received with rapturous applause. Ted Kennedy mockingly referred to the scheme as Star Wars, a moniker the SDI never really shook off. Critics who didn't simply think that the whole thing was ridiculous worried that it might inflame tensions at a period when the Cold War was running particularly hot.
Reagan was adamant that the SDI could be built without the US breaking its commitments under the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, but both the USSR itself and many within America who wanted to avoid nuclear war viewed it as a provocation the world just didn't need.
So I think a lot of this goes back to what I mentioned a little bit before with the US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, where ballistic missile defenses are unfettered. You know, theoretically you could have as many as you wanted, right? This raises concerns from other countries in their ability to hold the United States or whoever at risk.
That the Strategic Defense Initiative was a complete and total failure is evident in the fact that just a few years later, Reagan was back at the negotiating table working on the First START Treaty. The program had proven too expensive and continued to show few signs that it would even be successful. It wasn't until after it had pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in the early 2000s that the US would finally gain a defense system theoretically capable of defending against intercontinental ballistic missiles. And even then, the so-called ground-based mid-course defense system is both extremely expensive, extremely limited, and pretty debatable in its efficacy. It cost at least $90 billion over the 20 years of its development and still has a success rate of just 55% during highly controlled tests. Worse still, the system tops out at just 44 missiles. Should an all-out nuclear war break out, the US has just 44 chances to maybe stop less than 50 missiles.
These systems don't work. You know, they have a very, very low, success rate. It is literally a bullet hitting a bullet.
The problem is that, as simple as it might sound to simply build a bigger version of the Iron Dome, the idea doesn't really scale up. Israel is tiny, smaller even than it thinks, while America is a whole continent. More than this, the weapons that the Iron Dome is set to defend against are much smaller and shorter range than those which would likely be used against the US. And even that has cost billions and billions of dollars.
None of this, of course, has stopped Trump and his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, from continuing to talk up the potential of the system.
All we care about is protecting the homeland. President Trump has said for a long time, defense of the homeland is critical. America first. America and Americans. Golden Dome is a generational investment in that to ensure we keep our people safe. That's it.
The Pentagon has announced awards of contracts to over 1,000 companies who may end up working on the system. Small contracts have reportedly been awarded to Northrop Grumman, True Anomaly, Lockheed Martin, and Anduril to build work on proposed systems. To bring this video full circle, General Michael Gwettlin of the US Space Force has compared the system to the Manhattan Project.
This is on order of magnitude of the Manhattan Project. It's going to take a concerted effort from the very top of our government. It's going to take a national will to bring all this together.
And yet, even exactly what this is at the most basic level remains to be seen.
Complicating all of this is the fact that an eternal truth of nuclear politics is that bluster, saber-rattling, and so-called posturing are a core part of the game. Even the ambition to build a golden dome might project strength abroad and comfort at home. We go again. There are plenty of Reagan stands out there who will continue to argue that Star Wars was actually an ingenious negotiating tactic designed to force concessions from the Soviets. As those involved in the drafting of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty knew way back in the 1970s, however, there is a danger to projecting too much strength. It risks exacerbating tensions at a time when we are already looking like we might be at the beginnings of an arms race.
Because of this, countries are developing capabilities that allow them to potentially bypass missile defenses. So whether it's hypersonics, HGVs, cruise missiles, a lot of these capabilities have existed in the past, but developing them, deploying them, and implementing them in ways that seem to provide an advantage to the country that has them.
The real risk, however, isn't that Donald Trump convinces you or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping that the Golden Dome works. The real risk is that he convinces himself. The manner in which politicians and military leaders have started talking about nuclear weapons in recent years has taken a significant turn. Way back at the height of the Cold War, the one thing really holding them back was that age-old principle of mutually assured destruction. An era in which Donald Trump or anyone else feels like they can use nuclear weapons with impunity is one in which that option is going to look increasingly tempting. Oof. Right. Oh, that was fun while that lasted.
Okay, so I lied to you. Earlier on, I promised to tell you a bunch of things which had changed between the previous nuclear age and this one. And that is kind of what this video has been about. In truth though, most of the things which are currently propelling us towards potential nuclear war today are a result of forgetting lessons which we already learned during the height of the Cold War. We know that so-called tactical nuclear weapons, such as those which could be dropped by the F-35A fighter jets the UK is currently buying, are incredibly dangerous. We know that missile defense systems like Golden Dome don't really work. You don't have to have seen war games to know that winning a nuclear exchange is all but impossible.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.
The only way we've ever managed to reduce nuclear risk is through diplomacy. And at the moment, not only is that kind of diplomacy not happening, but the concept of diplomacy itself is being viewed as foolish and naive. And the potential consequences of that are absolutely terrifying.
As treaties expire and countries shift towards rearmament, a whole economy of arms production is being rekindled.
The Ministry of Defence here in the UK is set to invest an extra £4.4 billion into the Devonport dockyard over the next decade. If you want to learn more about the actual logistics of arms production, you'd love The Logistics of Arms Manufacturing, the 6th episode in The Logistics of X, a series by the team behind Wendover Productions which uncovers the inner workings of various different industries including defence, fishing and the harsh.
The Logistics of X is available to watch exclusively on Nebula, the premium streaming service created by myself and a bunch of other clever creators.
It's just one show in an ever-expanding catalogue of exclusive films and series which are only available to watch on Nebula. I'm currently really enjoying Tara Mooney's Nebula exclusive series Politics. It's a really fun and funny dive into the politics of breasts and the history thereof. It's a perfect example of why Nebula is so great for both audiences and creators.
If Tara had made Politics and just put it up on YouTube, I think we all know what the chances of it actually turning up in anyone's recommendations feeds would have been. Nebula allows us as creators to make shows for you as viewers without having to worry about whether any recommendations or monetization feeds are going to hide them away.
More than this, in an era where YouTube has become more and more clickbaity, our goal with Nebula is to make a genuinely prestige experience where you can actually find something high quality and enriching to watch without wasting a million hours scrolling through slop.
All of us involved in creating Nebula are viewers as well as creators, and we want it to be a high quality experience.
We also want it to be affordable. In fact, if you sign up using my link, go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, you'll get 50% off an annual plan, which brings the cost down to just $2.50 per month. We also now take pounds sterling, in which case it will cost you £2.50 a month, which is an absolute steal.
Alongside being a fantastic package of stuff to watch, signing up to Nebula using my link, go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas, really does help to support the channel at a time when making videos for the internet is getting harder and harder. Not only do we get paid more every time you watch our videos on Nebula rather than on YouTube, but I also get a little kickback when you sign up using that link, which is really helpful too. That link again is go.nebula.tv/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much for watching once again, and I'll see you over on Nebula. All that's left for me to do is to say a massive thank you to the people who support my work by being signed up to the top tier of my Patreon over at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Those people are Richard, Gary, Dick on Spain, Bill Mitchell, ZC Reese, Zoe Alden, Alexander Blank, Neil to Buildguard, Sophia R, Sergio Suarez, Richard Rapoon, Amit Singh Parahar, Gabriel Koch, Fiasco Linguini, Agent Maxwell, Glenn Sugden, Emil, Jarabar, Yillamson, Paulius Edicus, Sam Fortunato, Sondre Arsenjean, Douglas Urquhart, Ahmed Harachik, and Hast.ie. Thank you so much to all those people. If you'd like to find out how you can join them supporting my work, you can find out how to do so over at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thanks so much for watching once again, and I'll see you in the next video.